our next guest during the break had the unique and disturbing distinction of hearing my version of Video Killed the Radio Star singing. I do the entire Buggles repertoire, actually, Ryan Grimm. Ryan Grimm is the Washington bureau chief for the Huffington Post. He is a contributor to MSNBC. He is a former staff reporter with Politico in the Washington City paper and is the author of the book, This Is Your Country on Drugs. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Always great to have you on the program, and this week, since you're an expert on drugs and drug policy, is there some sort of antidote they can inject, atropine or something, to get over the sort of disorienting effect of watching the Republican debate this week?
Most drugs would be effective, I think.
All right, so pretty much just grab a few and have at it. Okay. So we did have a Republican debate this week. What'd you think? What was your overall impression?
You know, I feel like there's diminishing returns to these. The first one was just one of the most entertaining things that has ever been brought to television. But after that, there isn't much else to go on. It's not like these are genuine, debates around policy. It's just, whose staff came up with a better one-liner, or who delivered it better, and it winds up being kind of repetitive and boring. Although it does in an uncomfortable way end up kind of normalizing things that were far out in the marginal extremes just even months ago. Now you're discussing whether you ought to ban all Muslims from coming to the country or whether you should just prioritize Christians. That being the more liberal, respectable position. And so that's kind of how evil things kind of creep into the middle of conversations.
Right. I think that's a fantastic point. I think that one of the things we forget, and I'm guilty of this too, by the way, on this very program, Ryan Grimm, of sometimes by concentrating on Donald Trump, who's over the top. And last week I pulled quotes from Mein Kampf and quotes from Donald Trump and asked listeners if they could tell which was which. It's so tempting to do, and it. I haven't gotten a lot of feedback on it, but it was surprisingly hard. There were a couple quotes, especially about propaganda, where you would not know, and the effect you can make by saying something shocking, that where you really can't know which one you're talking about. But the problem with that is by pretending that the problem is localized in Donald Trump as he's this nutty, wacky guy with funny hair or whatever. The problem with that is exactly what you said, which is meanwhile, while he's doing that, he's actually shifting the debate. All these other guys are going along with it. None of them, none of the presidential candidates, some other Republicans have, but none of the leading presidential candidates have said, hey, no, wait a minute, this is out of line. We don't have a religious test for admission into this country or whatever it might be. As you say, they're normalizing it. So to what extent should we be having, in your opinion, less of a conversation about Trump, who in the end is a personality, and more of a conversation about the GOP as a kind of feeding mechanism for what are really extremist ideas?
I think there's that, and there needs to be more discussion about the roots of these extremist ideas. To kind of lay bare what we're talking about here, and instead you kind of have the opposite of what happens. He elevates them instead of people saying, this stuff comes from neo-Nazi hate groups, like, therefore it is neo-Nazi trash. Instead, you'll have on CNN or MSNBC or wherever else, you'll have lawyers interviewed and asked, tell us what are the mechanisms by which the American government might implement a policy of banning Muslims, and is it even constitutional? Well, you don't need a lawyer to kind of dissect that. Like, no, of course it isn't. It's terrible. It's horrible.
Right.
Who cares whether it could be implemented or how it could be implemented or what it would look like? It's crazy. It's lunacy. It's racism. It's bigotry. Like, it's not something that reasonable people should sit around a table, fold their hands, and discuss in an intelligent way. And when you do that, even if you are determining that it's unconstitutional or unworkable or whatever else, just by virtue of discussing it in respectable forums, you're like you said, you're normalizing it.
Well, absolutely, and this is one of the. It reminds me a little bit of the torture conversation in the mid 2000s when you had Alan Dershowitz and these other people talking about, we don't really like the idea of torture, but here's how you would do it, and here's how you could create a legal mechanism. I just remember I really annoyed Dershowitz, by the way, because every time he would write something where he would say, "I'm not an advocate of torture, but we have to recognize it's going to happen, and here's how we create a mechanism," I would always begin my rebuttal, which I would always write, "Noted torture advocate, Alan Dershowitz wrote this week." And finally he was like, "Who is this guy who's bugging me?" But I mean, to a certain extent, I feel that's what we should be doing here too. Someone else should be doing, and we all should be doing, is saying, no, wait a minute, exactly what you just said. This is not something that belongs in civil conversation. Gosh, where do we take? What about immigration? Are we, to a certain extent, maybe the only silver lining in all of this is that the hate speech about immigrants got pretty much sidelined for a while, but we had in the debate the other night, we had Cruz and Rubio going at it on immigration. What was your reaction to that?
Well, yeah, there's only so much room for hate, so it's nice that the anti-immigration stuff got pushed aside by the Islamophobia for a little while. And one last point on the torture debate, the flip side is a problem too. Like, in other words, when you had Dianne Feinstein and the Senate Democratic committee that investigated the torture program, they decided to ask the question of whether or not it was effective. Now, I think that all of the investigators were personally opposed to torture, and they concluded that it didn't work. That the different successes that the United States had were through things other than torture, and where torture was employed, it sent them in the wrong direction. And occasionally they had to be a little twisted to kind of get to those conclusions. But it raises the question: okay, well, what would have happened if you investigated this and you found that the answer to your question was yes, it is effective? Then what?
Right.
Then you're like, okay, let's do it. To me, the questions are much more fundamental. Is it moral? Is it legal?
Right.
And you can answer that quickly. It's immoral and it's illegal. And I think that they ought to. I don't know if they do, but they ought to regret that decision, because now you have somebody like Donald Trump saying, "I'm going to bring back torture," and I think it works. And what are we going to do? Wave around the 700-page torture report and say, "Look, this report says it doesn't work." And he's like, "Well, here's this, former CIA guy who says it does work." And now you're in this debate about whether or not it works. And if you're the one who has power and you believe that it works, or are willing to say that it works, then you're going to go ahead and do it. If the debate was whether or not it's moral or legal, then it would be much trickier to bring it back. If people actually went to jail for having engaged in the illegal behavior, then if you have a future President Donald Trump or some other demagogue who wants to do it, you'd probably have CIA agents say, "No, we're not going to do it, because my former colleagues went down for this, and this violates American values and American law." And so if you remove the conversation from one of values and place it in this kind of question of efficiency, then you lose the moral compass, and occasionally you're going to lose the efficiency debate.
It's such a fantastic point. We're talking with Brian Grimm, Washington bureau chief of the Huffington Post, and maybe it feels like a little divergence from the debate discussion, but it's so worth taking, and here's why. I mean, first of all, I can't agree with you more. Secondly, there will always be that one situation where doing the unethical, horrific, inhumane thing, illegal thing might work or might have worked. It always gets to, Scott Adams, the guy who does the Dilbert cartoon, said, well, before you challenge me on letting Muslims in, all Muslims in, uh, um, just let me know. And you can't answer this question until you let me know. I love when people set rules for conversations they're not governing. You can't let me know how many people are you willing to see die for your position? Well, you can do that with anything. If you start taking that utilitarian approach, you can say about torture, well, okay, I'm going to murder a terrorist's children until they talk. How many people are you willing to let die if you won't let me do that? Or that might have worked with al-Zawahiri, or no, there are some that we don't murder children, we don't torture, we don't discriminate on the basis of religion. As you say, that's not a conversation we should be having. It's a moral issue. So thanks for that. And by the way, you guys also pointed out, as did others, what was that about Ted Cruz and the classified information during the debate?
Oh yeah, that's quite interesting, huh? He, undoubtedly a leading critic of Edward Snowden. Ted Cruz, by virtue of his position, has access to some classified information, and it does appear like he leaked that classified information during the debate about the metadata program. These prosecutions are easy to make if people want to make them. And that's one of the unpleasant things about the kind of the national security world. If you fall out of favor in it with it, there is a good chance that you committed some felony accidentally. You could probably a zealous prosecutor who is immune from any kind of public pressure or anything else could mount a case against Hillary based on the top secret stuff that went through her server.
Right.
You can do those sorts of things. I think the case against Ted Cruz would be pretty strong. Now, those cases probably aren't going to be made. These are all people that, even though they disagree with each other, they support they support the government broadly. They're not Edward Snowden's.
Right.
They're not whistleblowers.
And you
but if
left
they were
out, by the way,
whistleblowers, you could
Ryan,
take the
sorry
same
to
evidence
interrupt,
and
Ryan
groom.
Grant, but you left out General Petraeus, David Petraeus, who
Right.
revealed a lot of confidential information to the writer who he was having an extramarital affair with. And somehow everybody wants to prosecute Snowden because he revealed information for moral reasons, classified information. But if you do it to get elected or get laid, I guess it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, he did have his career derailed for now, at least, and
but he didn't go to jail.
He didn't go to jail. He didn't go to jail. People like him don't go to jail.
Right. And is that the point? Is that what we're looking at now when Ted Cruz reveals information? Ted Cruz is not going to jail, even though he had purely selfish reasons for revealing this information?
Yeah, it's a good question.
So what's the big takeaway of this debate? We suffered through it. It's a big takeaway. You started out by saying diminishing returns. I think diminishing returns for the country for sure, because it's just driving the debate into the dumpster as far as ethics and standards of decency are concerned. But are these guys getting anything out of it at this point, or is it just pushing, trash back and forth across an empty parking lot?
Places where politicians go to die more than they go to live, and so people who survive them tend to be happy. But Donald Trump has made himself immune from dying by saying one lunatic thing after another, and seeing his numbers only rise. So any debate where he comes out as debatably the winner and still on top is a win for him. The closer you get to actual voting. His problem is still that he's not leading in Iowa, and Ted Cruz could easily beat him there, and he could easily lose New Hampshire to some establishment candidate. And then, his whole shtick is that he's a winner.
Right.
So what if you're a winner and you just lost twice? What are you? And so if he starts to unravel there, then that's it for him. But if he can somehow survive that, South Carolina, Nevada, and Super Tuesday are that's his home turf. That's your kind of George Wallace voter down there, and so it's still definitely up in the air.
So you think if he last question? I'm sorry to get back to this guy Trump, God, but he's addictive. You think he'd run as an independent?
Well, he can't in Ohio and Texas legally, so he's done. He has no path to the White House that I can see without Ohio and Texas, because there's the sore loser laws that they have there. And I don't expect that he'd be able to successfully mount a legal challenge to those. This is a guy who can't even get the Twitter handle Donald Trump. He has to have the real Donald Trump.
Right.
That which is not very impressive. So if he can't even get his own name as his Twitter handle, I don't think he's going to be able to get himself on a ballot in the face of those laws.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but that is actually a great place to leave it, and I'd be chuckling with glee at the prospect of his demise if it weren't for the ghastly specter of Ted Cruz leering over his shoulder. But that will have to be a conversation for another date, unfortunately. Ryan Grim, Washington bureau chief of the Huffington Post, as always, great to have you on the show. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.